In the skies and seas of the Philippine Sea, American pilots crushed wave after wave of Japanese aircraft, sinking carriers like Shokaku and crippling Taiho, while their own fleets held strong with minimal losses. What began as a desperate Japanese strike ended in overwhelming American triumph, remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese once again believed a naval clash would determine the war's outcome. Yet for 2 years, their battleships and carriers, hidden in the inland sea, had posed no real danger to the U.S. Navy. The celebrated vessels and veteran pilots who had struck at Pearl Harbor were gone, replaced by hastily built warships and inexperienced crews. Many of the skilled aviators now rested at the bottom of the ocean. Worse still, Japan's economy and fleet were strangled by a crippling fuel shortage caused by America's highly effective submarine campaign. Admiral Somu Toyota, head of the combined fleet, ignored these realities, though Japan's leaders saw their position worsening each day. By mid-1944, China remained a bloody stalemate. British troops had crushed the sieges at Imphal and Kohima, and American forces pressed toward the Marianas with overwhelming strength. 3 Marine divisions, 7 new battleships, and 15 carriers. Japanese naval doctrine from the 1930s had predicted a climactic confrontation in the Marianas, but the rise of carriers and submarines had already invalidated those old battleship-focused plans. Determined to try something new, Toyota entrusted Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, a seasoned 57-year-old flyer with the Imperial Navy's finest units, organizing them into the first mobile fleet under what was called the Ago Plan. They assembled at Tawi-Tawi in Borneo, close to vital oil fields. But American submarines prowled nearby, shadowing their every move and relaying detailed reports. U.S. commanders learned of the Japanese concentration, yet Admiral Raymond A. Spruance pushed ahead with the Saipan invasion, landing Marines on June 15th after days of heavy bombardment. The Japanese fleet, including the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, veterans of Pearl Harbor, plus converted liners Hio and Junyo, seaplane tender conversions Chitos and Chiyoda, the mighty super battleships Yamato and Musashi with their 18-inch guns, and the new carrier Taiho, set sail on June 11th. Taiho, designed with lessons from Midway's disasters, was considered Japan's most advanced carrier. The American submarine Flying Fish sighted them on June 15th, and Spruance braced for battle. The odds favored him heavily. 15 U.S. carriers against 9 Japanese, 7 battleships against 5, 21 cruisers against 13, and 69 destroyers against 28. On top of that, the U.S. fleet carried 891 aircraft to Japan's 430 carrier-based planes, though Ozawa also counted on 400 land-based aircraft at islands like Saipan and Iwo Jima. Even so, this would be the largest naval force Japan ever committed to sea, surpassing the Pearl Harbor strike force by half, with Taiho leading the way. Despite shortages of fuel and inexperienced pilots, confidence ran high in the Japanese ranks. Admiral Matome Ugaki even wrote in his diary that failure was unthinkable. Across the ocean, American aviators felt equally assured of their superiority. Future President George H.W. Bush was among them, serving aboard the USS San Jacinto. U.S. pilots had undergone rigorous training, often for years, under seasoned veterans, practicing carrier landings on converted training ships. Few had actual combat experience apart from those on USS Enterprise, but they vastly outnumbered the Japanese. Their F-6F Hellcats now outclassed the once dominant Zero, and their SBD Dauntless dive bombers remained more rugged than Japan's Judy, while the TBM Avenger was evenly matched with Japan's Jill torpedo bomber. As the Japanese advanced, their troubles began. American submarines struck the first mobile fleet, sinking a destroyer and damaging supply vessels. U.S. ships cracked Japanese radio codes and hunted their subs, destroying 17 scouts sent ahead of Ozawa's force. British escorts added to the toll, sinking 6 more in less than 2 weeks. While the Marines fought on Saipan, both sides scoured the seas with search planes, each trying to pinpoint the other's fleet. On his flagship Indianapolis, Spruance pondered his options, suspecting Ozawa meant to draw him westward to expose the amphibious forces. He recalled the lessons of Guadalcanal, when premature withdrawal of supply ships had nearly doomed the Marines, and resolved not to repeat the mistake. He adopted a defensive stance. Let the Japanese strike first, then counter with superior radar, artillery, fighters, and numbers. He directed Vice Admiral Willis Lee in charge of the battle line and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the carriers, to hold their forces close. In the meantime, they were to keep bombing Japanese airfields on Guam and Tinian while supporting operations at Saipan. Spruance's battle plan was clear. U.S. aircraft would target enemy carriers first, then hit battleships and cruisers. If the Japanese retreated, the American battle line would finish off crippled vessels. If they stood and fought, U.S. superiority would grind them down. Above all, he ordered aggressive pursuit to ensure total destruction. Mitcher bristled at the cautious approach, eager to strike first, while some of his staff derided Spruance as too tied to battleships. Lee, though obedient, worried about night combat, knowing from past experience that Japanese crews excelled after dark while his own still lacked training. "Do not, repeat not, seek night action," he warned, though he agreed to pursue fleeing enemies by day. On June 18th, American direction finders located the Japanese fleet 355 miles away, and codebreakers intercepted Ozawa's orders to his island air bases. Mitcher urged a night advance, but Spruance, wary of deception and reports of Japanese movement farther south, declined. Mitcher's officers fumed, calling Spruance timid, and one Yorktown officer even cursed him in his diary. But Spruance, calm and confident, went to bed after giving his orders. Aboard Task Force 58, sailors and airmen prepared through the night, fueling planes, arming torpedoes, and manning stations. At 3 a.m. on June 19th, whistles, bugles, bells, and alarms summoned every American ship to battle stations as the greatest carrier duel of the Pacific War was about to begin. As daylight broke, the weather offered near-perfect flying conditions, with calm seas, clear skies, and a steady wind from the east, leaving little natural cover from Japanese aircraft. Aboard the American ships, sailors went through their well-rehearsed routines of preparation for battle. They strapped on steel, helmets and Mae West life jackets, secured hatches and portholes by setting Condition Z, and manned their combat stations. Task Force 58, the core of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, moved steadily about 158 miles west-southwest of Saipan. The carriers, protected by their escorts, steamed into the wind so that aircraft could take off easily, while the battle line of battleships kept to the rear, their heavy 16-inch guns ready against surface threats, and their batteries of 40mm and 20mm guns bristling against any enemy aircraft. On the Japanese side, Admiral Ozawa had fewer reconnaissance planes in the air compared to the Americans, forcing him to depend on long-range scouts to pinpoint Spruance's ships. On June 18th, those search planes succeeded, and Ozawa prepared to act. He left his 6 heavy carriers in the main body while sending the light carriers Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho forward with Yamato and Musashi, creating what was called the Van Force. The Japanese Navy had long relied on a tactic of using one group as bait to draw away the American carriers and fighters, while a more powerful striking unit attacked the main fleet. Since Pearl Harbor, this strategy had been a signature maneuver, and Ozawa prepared to attempt it once again. Confident he could deliver a devastating blow, he made ready to hurl more than 300 aircraft at the Americans, who still did not know where his fleet was positioned. The opening of the Battle of Midway had been the reverse situation. Then it was the Japanese who had sailed blind while the Americans struck from concealment. Now, though Spruance had the stronger force, his scouts had yet to locate Ozawa. At dawn, the American fleet maintained a disciplined zigzag pattern while guarding the Saipan invasion, continuing eastward into the wind to enable rapid launches. At 10:23 a.m., Spruance suggested to Admiral Mark Vichchu that, if no Japanese fleet units appeared, they should send strikes against enemy airfields on Guam and Rota, since those islands were obvious forward bases where Ozawa's planes could land, rearm, and then strike back at the invasion fleet. Even as Spruance weighed options, Vichchu was already skirmishing with land-based aircraft as they threatened Task Force 58. He launched sweeps and combat air patrols over Guam, engaging enemy planes. Meanwhile, Ozawa unleashed 30 search planes at 4:45 a.m., and by 7:15 a.m., one scout finally sighted Vichchu's fleet. American fighters quickly shot down several of the Japanese scouts, but the discovery was enough. Ozawa now moved to attack, and at 8:30 a.m. he ordered the first large raid, later called Raid 1 by the Americans. 69 aircraft took off from the van force, 45 Zeros converted into bombers, 8 Jill torpedo planes, and 16 Zeros as escort fighters. By 10:05 a.m., the battleship Alabama's radar picked them up, high and to the west, and the order went out across the task force to prepare for combat. Sailors sprinted to their stations. On Alabama, one of those men was Bob Feller, the famed baseball pitcher who had volunteered for sea duty instead of remaining stateside. He now commanded a 40mm mount and, like the rest of the crew, braced for attack. Admiral Vichchu, realizing a strike was imminent, sent out the coded recall, "Hey Rube," an old carnival cry for help, ordering his aircraft that had been raiding Guam to return and bringing reserve fighters up from the hangars. Pilots in their ready rooms jumped to their feet, gulped down coffee, and raced to the flight decks. Hellcats roared into the air, directed westward by controllers like Lieutenant Joe Edgar, who carefully vectored them toward the incoming enemy. Within minutes, American squadrons were climbing and fanning out, orbiting in groups as ordered, awaiting the Japanese. Commander Charles Brewer's fighters from Essex were among the first to intercept. As they sighted the enemy, Brewer and his men shouted with excitement. He opened fire, tearing apart one Zero in a fiery explosion, then blasted another from the sky as its wing broke off and it plunged into the sea. In quick succession, Brewer shot down 4 planes, skillfully maneuvering through fire and wreckage. Other squadrons from Hornet, Princeton, and Monterey joined in, including those from Cowpens, where a young Gerald R. Ford served as assistant navigator. The skies quickly turned into chaos, but the Hellcats proved overwhelmingly superior. American pilots cut through the Japanese formation with disciplined attacks, scattering them in all directions. Some pilots likened the white contrails to skywriting shows from before the war. A Chicago-born ace flying an older Hellcat struggled, with oil splattering across his windshield, but still pressed on. Radio channels buzzed with confused chatter as orders mixed with idle talk, yet the American pilots kept the advantage. Vichchu wisely held back his bombers and torpedo planes, keeping them safe while the fighters shredded the first wave. Of the 69 planes that had set out in Raid 1, most were shot down before they could even reach the American ships. A handful became lost and diverted to Guam, and a few went down at sea, unable to complete the long overwater flight. Those that survived now pushed toward the carriers and battleships, determined to inflict damage. Inside the American battle formation, the battleship Indiana kept station in the center, serving as the alignment point. Admiral Willis Lee controlled the line from Washington, his flagship. The veteran South Dakota, considered unlucky by many. Cruz, despite a hard-fighting record at Santa Cruz and Guadalcanal, became the main target. She had a history of mechanical mishaps, including a crippling electrical failure at a critical moment in 1942, which had damaged her reputation. On this day, she braced again for attack. Among her junior officers was a young Sergeant Shriver, destined years later to marry into the Kennedy family and serve as the first director of the Peace Corps. Seamen on nearby ships like the cruiser Montpellier saw their first full-scale air attack unfold. One sailor wrote in his diary that the sky seemed filled with exploding shells. Columns of spray shot up around the ships, Japanese aircraft plunged into the ocean, and bombs splashed dangerously close. The air was thick with smoke, the thunder of guns, and the roar of engines. American anti-aircraft crews, including Feller's team on Alabama, poured out a torrent of fire. Feller later described how the Japanese kept coming for hour after hour, and how the gunners on Alabama never left their weapons, loading and firing without pause while eating rations where they stood. He recalled spotting Betty bombers on the horizon, opening up at long range and watching smoke and tracers fill the sky until the planes either turned back or broke apart. He remembered the air reeking of cordite and the sense of relentless action as his 4 guns hammered away. Aboard Washington, another officer explained afterward that normally Japanese raids came in as coordinated groups, often out of the sun. But this time the survivors were scattered, approaching in disorganized fragments from every direction. The long harassment, later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, felt endless as wave after wave staggered in. But by the time they reached the formation, most of their strength had already been stripped away by American fighters. Beneath the decks, in the combat information centers of the carriers and battleships, sailors worked with focus in windowless rooms lit by radar scopes. They tracked the battle in real time, listening to constant reports from lookouts, pilots, and gunners over headsets. Using plotting boards of glass, they marked enemy aircraft in red grease pencil and American planes in white, adjusting the lines whenever a radar operator called in a new bearing. Identification. Friend or foe devices carried by U.S. aircraft allowed them to distinguish between allies and enemies, helping them avoid friendly fire in the confusion. For those watching the boards, the battle was a shifting dance of colored marks, showing the destruction of Ozawa's first great strike. As the Japanese formations drew nearer and the radar screens showed ever fewer bogies, American fighter pilots grew more buoyant. But the day brought mixed fortunes. True to South Dakota's unlucky reputation, a 551-pound bomb slammed into her forward superstructure, tearing a gash through pipes and wiring, wrecking the admiral's and captain's quarters. Putting a 40mm mount out of action, killing 27 men and wounding 24 more, and touching off bitter arguments between crews over who had actually downed the attacker, gunners aboard South Dakota insisted they'd sent the plane into the sea, while men on Alabama maintained it had escaped. Flying off Cowpens, Lieutenant J.G. Frederick R. Stiglitz radioed that he had splashed a plane and seen another go down, but soon suffered engine failure and was forced to ditch. He was seen boarding a life raft but was never recovered. Meanwhile, Japanese dive and torpedo squadrons circled to the east, burning fuel as they awaited orders, and finally Mitcher sent Enterprise's torpedo planes to search for the enemy fleet while other airmen readied to follow. 10 minutes after Edgar's fighters cleared the screens, Raid 2 began. Ozawa launched a mixed force. 48 fighters, 27 torpedo bombers, and 35 dive bombers, but their problems started at once as the van force's heavy anti-aircraft fire damaged 8 aircraft and shot 2 down, forcing the remainder to pull back. The chaotic formation exposed a deeper issue: the declining quality and cohesion of Japanese air crews, whose varying speeds and poor coordination broke the strike into smaller, ineffective groups. Among the exhausted veterans was Zenji Abe, a rare flyer who had survived both Pearl Harbor and Midway. He later said fatigue made him feel as if someone else was flying his aircraft, and as his frayed formation dwindled, he wondered whether missing comrades had fallen away from confusion or turned back. When Abe and his comrades closed on the American ships at about 10:27, a dozen Hellcats from Essex under Commander David McCampbell intercepted them, and McCampbell and his pilots tore into the attack, scattering and shredding the Japanese fighters before they could organize. In one dramatic episode, a Japanese pilot spotted a torpedo wake heading straight for Taiho, and in a desperate bid to save his carrier, dove his plane into the torpedo, sacrificing himself to disrupt the weapons. Run. The action was heroic but could not stop the incoming salvo. The torpedoes had been launched by the 1,525-ton Gato-class submarine Albakor under Commander Jim Blanchard, one of the picket subs ordered the day before to steam seaward and intercept. At about 7 a.m., a Japanese scout sighted Albakor on the surface, and Blanchard promptly dove. By 7:50, he had spotted enemy ships to the west and ordered battle stations submerged. Through his periscope, he found a carrier making east at a broad angle, its lights burning to help the Japanese read their instruments, and he maneuvered for a firing solution, then loosed 6 torpedoes in quick succession at the large flat top. One struck near Taiho's aviation fuel tanks, while 4 passed astern. The hit produced a violent explosion, and the carrier began to suffer damage. Her forward elevator jammed in the up position, and she lost a knot of speed, though damage control initially reported no fires. Depth-charging warships soon homed onto Albakor and hammered her with charges that shook the boat, shattered light bulbs, and hurled men about the deck. But Blanchard's skillful captaincy and the submarine's ability to go deep allowed her to slip through the counterattack and survive. Unknown to many aboard Taiho at first, the torpedo had ruptured oil and gasoline lines, a hidden wound that would prove dangerous later even as Ozawa maintained confidence in his new flagship's design. While Albacor's attack unfolded, Raid 2 pressed in on Mitcher's carriers. At about 11:07 a.m., Wildcats and Hellcats, vectored by fighter directors, dove from high altitude to meet the incoming Judies and other attackers, and McCampbell wasted no time cutting into the formation with fast, slashing passes that broke up the enemy. His guns jammed at one point, forcing him to pull back to refuel, but not before claiming several victories. In this action, McCampbell began to build the score that would later make him the Navy's top ace. Squadrons from Essex, Hornet, Princeton, Monterey, and Cowpens joined the melee, among them pilots whose wartime paths would later lead to prominence, and men who returned with aircraft raked by dozens of bullet holes. Chicago-born aces and other veterans cleaned oil from cracked canopies and rejoined the fight, and pilots like Vichchu went on furious streaks, blasting Judies aside in rapid succession until the remaining dive bombers and torpedo planes were either shot into the sea, forced off to Guam, or lost in the long overwater transit. Despite occasional stoppages and the hazards of combat, American fighter squadrons utterly shredded the Japanese attack, while the carrier's anti-aircraft and the battle line's heavy guns added to the toll, turning what had been a determined assault into a shattered, desperate series of strikes that failed to penetrate the American defensive screen. American fighter pilots grew louder with triumph as radar returns dwindled. But the day held darker moments too. True to her unlucky reputation, South Dakota took a direct hit when a 551-pound bomb struck her forward superstructure, ripping out piping and wiring, wrecking the admiral's and captain's quarters, disabling a 40mm mount and killing 27 sailors while wounding 24. Tempers flared among crews as some South Dakota gunners insisted they had downed the attacker, while men on Alabama claimed the bomber escaped. Off Cowpens, Lieutenant J.G. Frederick R. Stiglitz radioed that he'd scored a splash and another probable, only to suffer engine damage and ditch. He was seen climbing into a life raft, but was never recovered. Japanese dive and torpedo squadrons circled to the east, burning fuel and awaiting orders, and Mitcher finally tasked Enterprise's torpedo planes to seek the enemy, while other squadrons stood by. 10 minutes after Edgar's screens cleared, Raid 2 began. Ozawa launched a mixed strike. 48 fighters, 27 torpedo planes, and 35 dive bombers, but the van force's heavy anti-aircraft guns chewed them up, damaging 8 aircraft and shooting 2 down, forcing the survivors to break off. The disorderly assault exposed a wider problem of declining pilot skill and coordination as varying speeds and confusion splintered formations. Among the weary veterans was Zenji Abe, who had flown at Pearl Harbor and Midway and later confessed. Fatigue made him feel as if someone else was at the controls. Approaching the fleet around 10:27, Abe and his dwindling group were met by a dozen Hellcats from Essex under Commander David McCampbell, and McCampbell's pilots tore into the attackers before they could organize. In one desperate episode, a Japanese pilot saw a torpedo wake closing on Taiho and, in a final act of sacrifice, dove his plane into the torpedo to try to save the carrier. His courage slowed one weapon, but could not stop the rest. Those torpedoes had been launched by the Gato-class submarine Albakor under Commander Jim Blanchard, which on the morning picket run had been sighted and dove to periscope depth. Spotting a carrier steaming east at about 7 miles, Blanchard maneuvered and fired 6 torpedoes, one of which struck near Taiho's aviation fuel tanks, while others missed astern, producing a violent explosion that jammed the forward elevator and slowed the carrier by a knot, though initial reports said no fires. Albakor then endured a furious depth-charge counterattack that shook the boat, broke light bulbs and hurled men about, but Blanchard ran deep, rode out the assault, and survived to confirm the damage. Unseen at first, ruptured oil and gasoline. Lines on Taiho would later prove dangerous, even as her crew rushed to control what they could. While that drama unfolded beneath the waves, Raid 2 pressed the carriers. Fighter directors vectored Hellcats and Wildcats into high-speed slashing. Attacks and pilots like McCampbell claimed multiple victories even as gun stoppages and oil on canopies hampered them. By day's end, he had added to his tally, beginning the run that would make him one of the Navy's top aces. Squadrons from Essex, Hornet, Princeton, Monterey, and Cowpens all piled into the melee. Planes returned riddled with bullet holes. Others had their windshields fouled by oil yet pressed on. And American fighters and shipboard anti-aircraft devastated the approaching Judies and Jills. A few Japanese bombers did break through to strike picket ships. The destroyer Stockham was repeatedly attacked for some 20 minutes, but escaped hits thanks to fighter cover and accurate flak, and Lieutenant William Lamb of Princeton, with only one operational cannon, called for help and nonetheless blasted 3 Jills out of the sky. Enterprise's veteran pilots rushed to defend a battleship and sent a Judy into flames. Other crews disrupted torpedo runs, shooting attackers into the sea or crippling their aircraft before they could release weapons. Enterprise and light carrier, Princeton endured close attacks. One Judy's bomb fell near Wasp and wounded sailors. A Jill's torpedo run on Princeton was foiled as the plane was shot down and its torpedo missed, and another torpedo splashed harmlessly 300 yards off Princeton after the bomber was destroyed. At Bunker Hill, Lookout spotted Judies diving from 12,000 feet, and the ship's guns shredded one bomber in half. A near miss detonated by the carrier's elevator killed 2 and wounded 27, set ready rooms afire and ruptured fuel tanks and vents. Yet damage control teams kept the carrier fighting. By about 12:15 p.m., American radars were largely clear of attackers. Of the roughly 128 planes Ozawa had sent, only about 31 Zeros, 11 Judies, and 4 Jills made it back. Flaming wreckage, oil slicks, and scattered debris littered. The waters around the fleet and the Japanese air arm's hopes were in tatters. Ozawa's carriers, however, still steamed on. Aboard Taiho, inexperienced damage control crews worked to stem leaks and pump fuel overboard while crude oil sloshed across hangar decks. And in an ill-advised effort to purge fumes, an officer ordered blowers and ventilation doors opened, a choice later criticized for spreading fuel vapors. As the chaos on Taiho continued, another American submarine, Cavala under veteran skipper Herman Clare, closed on Ozawa's force to exploit the confusion. After evading discovery overnight, Cavala slid into position at about 10:39 a.m. Spotted Shokaku steaming at high speed with a crowded flight deck and fired a spread of torpedoes. Escorts rushed in and pounded Cavala with depth charges for hours, causing leaks and stressing the new sub, but the surface ship's fate was sealed. Shokaku took multiple torpedo hits. Her bow flooded, the forward elevator jammed, and fires raced through the carrier until a magazine detonation late in the afternoon finished her off. sending her to the bottom with the loss of 9 aircraft and roughly 1,263 of her crew. Cavala's crew heard the terrible explosions and reported the sinking, and Commander Clare radioed Admiral Charles Lockwood that the carrier had gone down. Lockwood congratulated the boat and dryly noted 8 carriers left, underscoring. That much of Japan's carrier force still remained. Cavala survived the war, earned high honors, and would later be preserved as a museum vessel. Yet, despite the enormous blows Ozawa had already taken, one carrier sunk, another badly damaged, hundreds of planes lost. The fight was not over, and Spruance still had not unleashed his full striking power against the battered Japanese fleet as the brutal engagement in the Philippine